Hello, welcome to Mind Chat. I'm Philip Goff.
Hello, I'm Keith Frankish.
How are you doing, Keith?
I'm good. I'm well, still COVID-free. How about you?
I'm not too bad. Yes, I think I've finally got my microphone working and turned on this week, so I'm gonna win all the arguments now. Finally got. That's why I've been losing the arguments, because of dodgy audio.
It's all about the medium, isn't it?
Absolutely. But no, I'm not too bad. Just still on research leave, getting this book together, which is flowing nicely. Still on strike again this week. I put in the show notes about the strike of UK academic staff if people want to learn about that or support that. But yeah, not too bad. So we're just running over. We're coming up to the end of season 2 of Mind Chat. It's actually next month is our anniversary, isn't it, Keith?
It's our anniversary. You remembered.
I did. I should get you flowers or something, shouldn't I? I think. So next month we have Anne-Sophie Barrich talking about smellosophy in April. Then in May we've got Angela Mendelevici. I was thinking, actually, I haven't raised this with you yet, Keith, but I was thinking maybe we could pitch that as part 2 in a way of how does consciousness connect us to reality. So that was the topic with David Papineau last month, and Angela's got a sort of the polar opposite view on, but still on this theme of, how does consciousness connect us to the world around us?
Mental representation, intentionality.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, and we're also having Causal Closure, a rematch with Sean Carroll on Causal Closure, getting the philosopher of physics, Barry Lower in. I think we've booked May for that as well. And then
reinforcements.
Absolutely, because I need some. Well, I don't know which side he'll come down on. He's going to be an impartial adjudicator. And then we'll have season 3, and we're going to have a little chat, aren't we?
We'll do some planning for season 3.
What we're going to put together, but lots of exciting guests in mind for season 3. Absolutely. So yeah, as always, we're don't ask for money or anything, but if you do want to support us, help us with YouTube algorithm, please do subscribe to the channel or the podcast, or comment, write us a 5-star review, like, and so on. Do you want to tell us who we've got today?
Yes, we have Helen Steward, who is Professor of Mind and Action at the University of Leeds in Yorkshire. And Helen's interests include the metaphysics, a centre on the metaphysics of mind and on the nature of agency, causation, and explanation, and also on the problem of free will, which was the subject of her 2011, I think, book, A Metaphysics for Freedom. Very important book, and we'll be talking a lot about that. In fact, that will be our main topic for the discussion. So shall we bring Helen in?
Absolutely. Hello, Helen. Welcome to Mind Chat.
Hello, Philip. Hello, Keith.
Good to have you on.
Yeah.
It's very good to be here. I'm looking forward to it.
Actually, Helen and I have a little bit of a backstory that I'm not sure you're aware of, actually, Helen. Because I don't know if I've said this to you before.
Oh God, what's coming now?
Because Helen's you're old school friends with my former teacher, Catherine Harrison.
Oh yes, I have noticed that. I've noticed that you and she are on one another's Facebook.
So Catherine was one of those teachers at high school or senior school, as we call it, that really inspired me and really helped me out in lots of ways. And
I'm not at all surprised to hear it.
And then we kind of stayed in touch, but there's more. And then when I was first applying to think about doing graduate study in philosophy, she sent me to see you at Oxford when you were working at Oxford, and I came and had a chat with you in your office.
Did you really, Philip? I haven't put you together with that person.
Well, I think at that point, as a 21-year-old, I had a very young person's project. I told you I was going to see if we could live out moral nihilism. And
Did you
you were
really?
very polite with me, and I've changed. I'm actually a real hardcore moral objectivist now, but yeah. So that was anyway.
What did I say?
I didn't know you'd be a nihilist.
I think you were very, very kind and encouraging, and yeah.
I didn't put you off, clearly, because
No, I think I had a year out actually, and then came to my senses a bit. But yeah, so just the format for today. So we're mostly going to be talking about Helen's excellent book, A Metaphysics for Freedom, which is actually a fantastic book. It's a really detailed and intricate defense of a kind of free agency. Should say, I guess, that because there's a broad audience listening to this, with it is very much an academic book, isn't it? It might be. It's not a book aimed at a general audience, so it might be a bit challenging if you don't have a philosophy degree. But if you for philosophy graduate students, I think it's a really great book if you're interested in this topic. So we're mainly going to be talking about that. So we're just going to start off with some general get to know Helen Steward questions, and then we'll move on to Helen's view, kind of characterizing the general view, exploring maybe the main argument Helen gives in the book for it, and then exploring a couple of objections. And it's a defense of a form of what philosophers call libertarian free will, and we'll explore what that means a little more in a moment. Does that sound all right?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, I'll leave Dr. Frankish. I don't know why I'm calling you Dr. Frankish today. I'm feeling also respectful for some reason. Okay, Keith, would you like to go ahead with the first question?
Hi, Helen. Well, we'd like to begin by just getting to know the background of our guests a little bit. So you've spent, I guess, a lot of your life thinking about the nature of the mind, and agency and free will. How did you first get interested in this topic, and well, in philosophy in general, but then in the mind, the nature of the mind and agency in particular? How did this come to be the central topic you wanted to work on?
Good question. I stumbled into philosophy itself completely by accident. I went to university to do PPE, which is philosophy, politics, and economics. For those of the audience who might not know what it stands for, because I wanted to do politics and economics. Also, I thought those were things I thought I'd be very interested in, would like to do at university. And philosophy was just this sort of third thing that came along with politics and economics, and I didn't know much about it at all. But as soon as I started it, I loved it. I knew it was my subject immediately. And so I've carried on with it really ever since. And so far as, the mind and free will and those topics are concerned, I suppose I just found them fascinating as soon as I came across them. I've always been interested in the free will problem, always. And particularly in its kind of metaphysical version. I mean, the way I think of it, there's a sort of ethical version of the free will problem, which is all about moral responsibility. And then there's a sort of more metaphysical one, which is, well, how on earth is it possible for there to be beings of the sort that we tend to think we are? I mean, it just seems really hard to understand how things made out of, physical stuff could have these powers that we seem to have. So I've always found that issue fascinating. Not sure why. I just think it's one of those problems that's an old chestnut that people will be continuing to try to sort of crack for many years to come.
It's interesting, isn't it, that we're the sort of creatures who can, I guess uniquely in the animal kingdom, we're the sort of creatures who can reflect on our own existence and think about our own lives and our own existence and our own activity. And think, it's kind of really strange that here am I, sort of aware of the world and aware of myself and aware of that I'm acting in the world. And how does all that work? And I think that's probably at the root of the puzzlement that everybody in philosophy of mind, from whatever direction their whatever particular views they take, there is this deep puzzle about how how could I be here now doing the things I'm doing and experiencing the things I'm
Yes, it's that kind of clash between, you know, the third personal view of everything, the
Yes.
objective view, the view from nowhere, and
Yes.
you know, the subjective view, you know, the point of view of awareness and the point of view of agency. I would add,
Yes.
yeah.
I guess it's what Wilfred Sellers called the contrast between the manifest image, the world and our experience as it presents itself to us, and then the scientific image, the world as science describes it. And how do you reconcile these two, or how do you understand the relation between them?
That's right. And I suppose I've always been very keen genuinely to reconcile them. That's to say, what I mean by that is I think lots of people who feel the tension and the clash between the two end up sort of consigning one of them to the dustbin. And I don't want to do that, you know,
Right.
because both of them seem to capture something extremely important about the way things must be. And so I've always been looking for, you know, genuine reconciliation,
Right.
ways of really understanding how both can be true. Yeah.
We seem to perhaps have some technical issues that a lot of people are saying they can't see it, but some people are saying they can see it, and the number of viewers says 0 when it's definitely not 0. I don't know whether we should just carry on. At least, I mean, it's looking to me like it's up there, but should we just plow on?
I just on the tab with YouTube is not showing it, saying waiting for Mind Chat.
Yeah, mine is showing it.
Is it recording? That's the.
I've never had this issue before.
The crucial issue is that it's being recorded. Yeah.
So Mark O'Brien's saying you'll have the recording anyway. Well, why do you think that, Mark? I mean, it's up on my tab, and YouTube. Somebody is saying YouTube is having issues all over the place. It's saying 31. It's saying 31 viewers, and then it's cut to 0.
Looks like it's a problem with YouTube.
I assume that this is being recorded, but for some reason, some people are being cut off because of problems with YouTube. Shall we plow on? I mean, I'm looking on, you know, my connection to it, and it's appearing. Should we assume it's being recorded and continue?
I don't think there's anything we can do if it's a problem with YouTube. So I suggest we plow on, if that's okay with Helen.
Yeah, it's fine with me. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, I'm just hoping it's recovered. I think it should be recording. Okay, well, I mean, you've kind of answered this question in a way, Helen, but I suppose a lot of people might, of course, these are important issues, like the nature of human consciousness, the nature of human agency. But a lot of people might think, well, aren't these scientific questions? You know, shouldn't it be a scientific question, that the limits of human agency, how consciousness comes about, or whatever? Why do you think it's important specifically for philosophers to think about these issues in addition to scientists?
Well, I mean, I think it is a scientific question too. I mean, I sort of want to be clear about that. I think that, you know, many disciplines are needed, in fact, to make progress on these issues. They are very difficult, and they need the insights and the resources that many different disciplines have to offer. Well, and what I think philosophy can offer particularly is the resources of a discipline that knows that it can matter a lot, quite exactly how claims are couched. You know, quite apparently, ostensibly quite small distinctions can make a big difference to what it is that you're saying. You do need to fuss about some of those little details. I mean, a lot of my responses to, you know, various sorts of objection that arise to my position are kind of based on saying, well, look, you're saying this, but I'm saying this, and this doesn't actually conflict with that other thing that you're saying if you look carefully. So I think that kind of precision that philosophy can bring can help steer away through, you know, knotty thickets that look like they're impenetrable. Sometimes they're not impenetrable. They just take a lot of care and a lot of sorting out, and you can get through them in the end. And yeah, so I think philosophy is important. It stops us being waylaid by over simple sketches of the shape of a problem that we need to kind of get rid of.
So it's the precision and the rigor. Yeah, I've heard people say, you know, if we try to stop doing philosophy, we'll just end up with bad philosophy. I mean, it always makes me think of the book. What was the book Stephen Hawking co-wrote with Leonard Mlodinow? And it starts off saying philosophy is dead. You know, it doesn't tell us.
Right.
And then in later chapters, they go on to do some really bad philosophy, including about free will. And, yeah.
Maybe I could just say there that I think Helen's book in many ways is an exemplary piece of philosophy, a really good thing for young philosophers to study because of the way she does what you just said, Helen, the way you work very carefully through some problems, teasing apart different possible interpretations, different views that might be conflated, but also because of the way you're very charitable to opponents, people with different views. You always present the opposing view, the alternative view, with full sympathy, full clarity, full awareness of its power, before then going on to say how you respond. And I think that's a model, and in many ways this could be taken as a model of how to do, I think, analytic philosophy.
Well, thank you, Keith. I mean, I think, to be perfectly honest, though, one reason why I'm able to present the opponent's position with power is because I've been the opponent. You know, I think a lot of the positions I'm trying to refute are positions that I, at one time or another, have held and have come to think wanting. So often I really know what it's like to think those things because I have them.
Yeah, it's very important to get in your opponent's mindset, isn't it? That's what me and Keith spend a lot of time doing. But yeah, to really try and understand how your philosophical opponent, I should say, not you, is thinking about things, so that you can effectively respond, I guess.
Exactly, because you're not really going to make any progress otherwise, because you're going to be responding to a caricature of their view, which you know, refuting a caricature is easy and doesn't take us anywhere. And we're not really engaging and moving forward, because in the end we move forward together, I think. But
yes,
we all have the same aim, which is to try and find the best view of this, and we help each other along by pointing out the weaknesses in each other's positions.
Yes.
Well, that's how I like to see it.
Yeah. It looks like our technical problems are resolved, I think.
Good.
And somebody said if you're having difficulty, someone said they tried clicking on another Mind Chat video and then clicked back to this one and it worked, or Chrome rather than on a mobile. Anyway, well, we move to our quick fire round now, Helen, which is just to give people an overall view of some of your views on the big questions. So not going to get too bogged down in debate, but roughly 30 seconds on each of these three questions. Number one, does God exist?
I am an atheist, I have to say. I don't really have, any knockdown arguments for that. That's just my gut feeling. I guess it seems to me extremely improbable that there's a God. But that's not a view I could or ever have tried to sort of defend. It's just my attitude to the universe. And it means I don't have to face all kinds of tricky issues like the problem of evil and things like that. So it gets me out of the need to delve into certain intellectual territories.
Very good. I mean, it's interesting because sometimes people sort of say, people who believe in libertarian free will is just people who believe in God or something. So there was a big article by Oliver Berkman, who I really like, in The Guardian on free will. And the only mention of libertarianism, he said, some Christians believe in libertarianism.
I know.
Like I mean, someone else, my friend Martina Niederrummelen, who's a substance dualist, but is also very passionate that, this has nothing to do with religion. And this is, so yeah, it's worth pointing that out, I think. Yes. There's no essential connection there. Nor with panpsychism and spirituality. It's another. So what's our second one? Is there a heart? Well, we normally ask, do we have free will? But that's what we're going to be talking about a lot. Instead, I'm going to say, Is there a hard problem of consciousness? In terms
Yeah,
of that,
I think there is a hard problem of consciousness. Yes, I think we are nowhere near to really understanding how consciousness arises. I wonder if we ever will be. I mean, I don't want to be too Mysterian about the whole thing, but it does seem like one of those issues. It's difficult to see what would count as a satisfactory answer. Where's the satisfactory looking answer going to really come from? I mean, I guess you can never rule it out. You can never rule out the possibility of there being, advances in the imaginative understanding of phenomena that take you in leaps and bounds beyond what you can currently conceive of. But I think it's going to take something like that, something really extraordinary to enable us to get an answer that satisfies us to the hard problem. But I think it exists. I think it's there.
Didn't you know I've already solved it?
Oh, sorry, Philip. Sorry.
I'm only joking, obviously. So Mysterian, in case people aren't familiar with that word Mysterian, that was associated with Colin McGinn's position that he argued that we're sort of set up by nature, that we will never understand the explanation of consciousness, just as dogs can't understand mathematics or something. It was from the New Mysterians, who were a Latino band from the 60s, I think. And that's where Owen Flanagan got the name from. He jokingly referred to McGinn with that term, and then it sort of stuck as the name of the position.
I remember the Mysterons from Captain Scarlet, but
maybe they had the same view as well. I don't know. I think they were the first Latino band to get a #1 in the States. I don't know why I know that. Anyway, final question: is morality objective?
Well, that's a hard one, actually. Am I allowed to say I think some bits are and some bits aren't? I mean, I think I want to.
Yes, you are. You are.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, morality encompasses such a lot of things, doesn't it? And I think there's a kind of heart to it that's kind of culturally non-specific, that it would be right to say was objective. And then there's this huge, hinterland of other stuff that also gets called part of morality by distinct cultures, but which isn't part of that heart, and which couldn't be regarded as objective. That's
right.
what I'd be inclined to say. Yeah.
And you think it's a deep puzzles with the objective bit? Is it like deep puzzles about how we make sense of there being objective facts of that kind, or do you think it's not so?
Well, I mean, I think they have to be rooted in, as it were, objective facts about human beings. It wouldn't be. I don't think morality is objective in some kind of transcendent sense that's utterly unconnected with anything that anybody cares about. But I think there's a perfectly acceptable and sensible version of objectivity which connects it with human aspiration, need, and want.
Oh, right, that's interesting. That's an interesting take on it. Yeah, so it's objective, but objective facts about human nature or something.
Yes, something like that. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks. So I think at this point we know Helen incredibly well, or a little bit, and we'll move on to discussing Helen's book, A Metaphysics of Nature. Dr. Frankish, you gotta stop this. I don't know why. I'm gonna go.
Thank you, Dr. Goff. Okay, so let's maybe start right at the beginning. I guess there are three broad positions in thinking about free will. There's libertarianism on the one hand, and then there's hard determinism on the other, and then there's the having your cake and eat it position in the middle, which is compatibilism. And I know you want to make some very subtle distinctions between some of these versions of these positions, but could you just outline those three basic positions for us first, and say where you are on the spectrum from the hard libertarian, if you like, through to the hard determinist?
Do you think we should start off by just saying what those positions are, just in case?
Happy to do that. So All those positions, as usually characterized, are about the relationship between free will on the one hand, and then something that gets called determinism on the other hand. And determinism, well, there's different definitions, but roughly speaking, you can think of it as the idea that everything that happens is the product of the laws of nature together with the initial conditions at the start of the universe. So it's that sort of idea that everything that happens, in a sense, sort of has to happen given that the laws are fixed and the conditions are fixed. And then the question is, well, does that allow for free will or not? If you think it doesn't allow for free will, and that I would be someone who thought it didn't, you've sort of got a choice, because you've said that free will is incompatible with determinism. So it's incompatibilism that you're signing up to. And within the incompatibilist camp, you've got this choice, because you could either say, well, determinism's obviously true, so there isn't any free will then, in which case you'd be what Keith was calling earlier a hard determinist. You'd stick with your determinism, you'd stick with your deterministic guns, and you'd say, no free will then. Or you could say, oh, but it's obvious we've got free will. Well, it must be determinism that's wrong then, isn't it? So then you would be what Keith was earlier calling a libertarian. But the other thing, of course, you could say is you could answer that original question about whether determinism and free will are incompatible by saying, no, they're not. Okay. Free will is perfectly compatible with determinism. They can both be true. It can be true both that we've got free will and that determinism is true. So that's compatibilism. And I guess I would put myself amongst the libertarians. I think determinism and free will are incompatible, but I don't feel terrifically troubled by that, because I just don't think determinism is true. So no problem there.
Is it worth? Could you perhaps just say a little bit more about what we mean by free will here? I know this is part of the whole issue, but just, is free will just is libertarianism just the denial of determinism of the hard determinist position that our actions, that our behavior isn't determined by preceding physical conditions? Or
no, not
is it
quite
something
that.
a bit richer than that?
It's richer than that, I think. I mean, there's so many different ways of thinking about free will, Keith, that it's pretty hard to say what it is exactly. But I suppose for most purposes, and particularly when people are thinking about the potential conflict with determinism, most people are talking about a capacity that we think we've got to do other than we do, right? So there's this chain of things that we do as we lead our lives. We do this, we do that, we do the other. And for at least most of those things, we tend to think none of them was inevitable. You know, all of them were things such that we could have chosen to do a different thing at the time of action. It just so happened that we made choice A, but we didn't need to make choice A. It wasn't inevitable. It wasn't fixed. It wasn't settled that we would do so. That's the sort of nugget by means of which I try to get at the idea of free will. It's what philosophers would call a sort of modal idea. It's an idea about possibility. What could have been the case? Was it necessary that you do the thing you do, or was it actually possible that you might have done other things?
So that shows how there's room for, at least there's it seems in principle to be room for a sort of compatibilism, because compatibilists can say, well, this conception of ourselves as having been able to do otherwise isn't undermined by the existence of by the truth of determinism. The different ways of understanding what it means to be able to do otherwise, and not all of them are incompatible with determinism. So
that's right. I mean, that's usually the moves that compatibilists make. Many of the moves that compatibilists make focus on what it is to say that you could have done otherwise. You know, they will have understandings or try to persuade you that you have understandings of that notion of having been able to do otherwise, which don't conflict with determinism at all.
So it'll be to do with the nature of the processes that cause you to do.
Yes, I mean, they might say, well, what it is to have been able to do otherwise, really, in the sense that matters, is, for example, not to have been forced by another person, say, to do the thing you're doing, or not compelled or prevented by external forces. Or what it means is that if you'd wanted to, you could have done something else. And they'll say, look, none of these things is incompatible with determinism.
So if the causes are internal to yourself and of the right kind, then they'll say, oh, that's okay.
Exactly. So your action can be caused as long as it's the right kind of causation, is what they'll say.
Right.
Yeah.
Good. So I think it's probably a good point for Philip to move on to the next question here. You're muted, Philip. You're muted.
I guess sorry, I thought I'm getting all technological now with my microphone, but I'm just forgetting, now I'm forgetting to unmute myself. I mean, I guess we've discussed sort of the libertarian position in general, but I think, Helen, there are some quite distinctive features of your brand of libertarianism. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, I suppose the feature that has been sort of picked up on as the most distinctive in a way of my brand of libertarianism is that the kind of freedom that I want to argue is incompatible with determinism, is a freedom that I want to extend beyond the human race to many animals. I think throughout its history, for reasons that aren't surprising, people have wanted to talk about free will in connection specifically with human beings, and that's, it's largely because people have been interested in free will as a sort of ethical issue. The thought being, look, if it's going to be fair and just to blame me for things and punish me for things, it's got to be the case that I could have done other than I did. So the metaphysical issue and the ethical issue sort of get connected together at that point. If I couldn't have done otherwise, it's just not fair to blame me or punish me or regard me as, morally responsible for anything in any way. And of course, when you're focused on that ethical issue, you're bound to be focused on, human free will, because that's where we apply moral responsibility, the notion of moral responsibility. But in thinking about the sort of metaphysical free will problem, which I think of as like, the question how it can be possible for there to be beings that could have done otherwise, how it's possible for there to be creatures that things can genuinely be up to, as I like to put it, I started to think, look, it's not just human beings that are rather special and exciting from the point of view of looking as though they're creatures that have alternative possibilities available to them. It kind of feels to me like lots of animals have that too. If you watch a goat or an elephant or a dolphin or something moving about the world, they don't look like they're just, following an assigned trajectory. They look like they have the same kind of basic animal freedoms to do this or that as we do. And so I started to think about the free will problem in that context. I started to think, well, it looks a bit as though animal powers all by themselves raise interesting issues with respect to their compatibility or incompatibility with determinism. You don't have to think about, moral responsibility at all. You don't have to go that far up the evolutionary scale to start to think, there are interesting metaphysical issues about animals. How are animals possible? Animals seem to be these things that things can be up to. What does that mean? And how does it work? So I suppose that's one distinctive feature.
I guess connected to that as well, it's not for you free will. Philosophers always think it's to do with decisions, like making a moral decision or making. Whereas you're saying a lot of the things that are up to us are just everyday actions, like I think you say in your book, like, you know, eating a bit of toast or picking something up off the floor, or, you know, these everyday that we don't sort of think I'm going to decide what to do now, but you still think we're expressing our agency, we're moving our bodies in a way you believe is compatible with determinism, even in those sort of, as it were, trivial decisions. Is that, if I understood you right there?
Absolutely, that's right. I mean, I call my position agency and compatibilism, because it really is about this basic power that I call agency, the power to do things in such a way that we feel you could have done another thing at the same time. I don't mean at the same time, I mean at the time at which the power is ascribed, you could have done another thing.
So it's really so it's not about making, you know, big decisions about what to do with your life, or ethical decisions about whether to move the trolley onto this track or whatever to save somebody's life. It's much more about just being in the world as someone who's as an organism that's really sensitive to the world and responds to it in a very flexible way.
Exactly that. I mean, of course, I think it's relevant to these bigger and grander questions about, you know, the decisions that, you know, give sense and meaning to our lives, the big decisions, the ones that we do agonize over and so on, because there couldn't possibly be a creature that could make decisions like that didn't have much simpler kind of forms of agency as well. You know, I think the sort of simple, the basic capacities of agency underlie these grander ones. They are at the root of everything, but I think they raise issues all by themselves. So yes, it's about ambling around, eating toast, you know, scratching your head, all that basic stuff that we do as we amble about in our day. All that stuff is activity that seems to be up to us, and you know, that's again coming back to that notion of things being up to us. If those things really are up to us, then we need to understand what that means and how it's possible. And that in itself is a very difficult philosophical problem, I think.
So sorry, Philip, I know we've got another question, but just to suppose I was just you were saying this more basic kind of responsiveness, this more basic kind of agency is necessary to be able to be in the world of making moral decisions and ethical decisions and so on. So suppose I was just thinking, suppose you had a machine, a computer, whatever, was programmed with all sorts of moral principles, and you'd inputted a lot of philosophy into it, and it given it all these instructions about what to do in moral situations, and they say utilitarian principles, say, and it just acted on these, or it just executed these principles. So it might seem to be making it would be, you could use it as an expert guide, as it were, to how to make moral decisions. Still, it wouldn't really be morally responsible, because it wouldn't have that. It wouldn't be based in this agency, in this. It wouldn't actually be really engaging with the world at all. It would be just following some abstract principles, and it wouldn't really be acting at all. So its moral decisions wouldn't really be actions.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't think of that thing as an agent, as you've described it. The principles have been programmed in, you said. Yes. I mean, we wouldn't think of holding it responsible for anything, would we? And I mean, you'd have to elaborate the description very considerably before it became the description of something that one might think, well, maybe, you know, maybe this is a machine that is an agent. But just as you described it, Keith, no, I would say that was not an agent.
Well, I'm just thinking, suppose I then applied moral principles in that way. Suppose I've been brought up in a very strict moral code, and there are all these principles that have been drummed into me at an early age, in pretty much the way that the computer has, and I just followed them because I've been really trained very strictly to do that. Still, in my case, though, that would, am I right in thinking that would be a genuine agency, precisely because I was the kind of creature that had this kind of this freedom.
You could have done otherwise, right? Yeah. You did, in fact, accept, you know, these principles without questioning them. But it's hard to believe of adult human being under normal circumstances, that they really didn't have any opportunity to question what they had been told, and maybe read or find out some alternative viewpoints and think about them and so on. It's those things. It's the fact that you could have done otherwise, that makes you a morally responsible.
So that's why you focus on the more basic kind of agency.
Yeah, I mean, because I suppose at the end of the day, I'm thinking, if there's a problem about determinism, the problem is about the thought that, a system where it's just one little thing leading to another little thing leading to another little thing. If the system's like that, and it really is operating entirely deterministically, there is no room there for any could's have done otherwise at all. And that really does seem to me to rule out, it rules out everything of interest.
So I think
it rules out moral responsibility, but I think it rules out agency. You haven't got a being there. It seems to me you haven't got a being there that's doing anything. You've just got stuff happening in a place.
Right.
So I think we're nicely, really smoothly moving on to the motivations for the view. Sorry, I interrupted you, Helen. I was trying to get in before Keith came back, but I ended up interrupting you. So I think we're smoothly moving into the motivations. So, and connected to what we've been saying so far, as I understand it, so your view is not so much that free will is compatible with indeterminism, but just agency, just any kind of agency. And that's because your concept of agency is about creatures who, you use this word, settle things, can settle matters, or as you said there, things that are up to us. And then the thought is, if determinism were true, everything will be already settled. There'll be nothing left for us as agents to settle. And if that's just part of the definition of what an agent is, that they settle things, then the universe has to, as it were, leave certain things for us to settle. Is that roughly right? Is that the...
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. I mean, yes, I don't really like the term free will, although I've been using it a lot because it is the traditional term. But it troubles me a bit in various ways. It troubles me. But one thing I don't like about the literature and the way the literature nearly always goes is that you've got, the way many people seem to think about it, you've got the big category of actions, and then within it, there's this kind of narrow band at the top of the free-willed ones, right? There's some special category of free-willed actions, which are such that you could have done otherwise. And then there's this massive range of others that we're supposed to think, what, just are determined? That just seems like wholly the wrong way to think about actions to me. I feel like all actions, right, are such that they needn't have happened. They needn't have been executed by us. That's what an action is. And so I really wanted to sort of reconceive that landscape and say, no, let's not think in terms of the bog standard actions, which are all determined, and then this sophisticated little kind of narrow ribbon on the top of the ones that are free-willed. That can't be right, surely. No, rather, it's a special realm. The realm of action is a special realm in that it's characterized by the possibility of other things having happened. So that was very much part of the way I wanted to conceive of things.
And I suppose to deepen this argument, our understanding of this argument, I guess it's important to consider the compatibilist perspective on that issue. So I imagine your average compatibilist isn't going to say, we don't settle things. They might agree. They're likely to agree with you. Yeah, of course, agents settle things. Of course, things are up to us. But they will give a different spin on what it is for an agent to settle things. Specifically, they'll give it an account of that is compatible with determinism. Could you maybe say a little bit about, to get clear for us, the dispute between you and a compatibilist on what it is for an agent to settle things, and how you rule out that compatibilist alternative that might be occurring to many viewers and listeners?
Yeah. So I think what many compatibilists would say is something like this. Look, what it is for me to settle things is actually for certain of my mental states to be causally efficacious in bringing about the action. So, you know, perhaps beliefs and desires, maybe intentions, maybe decisions. I mean, different compatibilists will have their own favorite view of quite what the mental landscape has to be that's productive of action. But usually they've got some idea of a sort of realm of mental states and events. And what they'll say is, well, what we mean when we say an agent settles things is that certain mental states of that agent cause their actions. That's what we mean. And of course, that's a picture that's perfectly compatible with causal determinism. You know, the states can deterministically bring about the action. And indeed, compatibilists might add, isn't that what we want? You know, don't we want our actions to be brought about by things like our beliefs and desires and intentions and so on, and decisions and that sort of thing? So I think that'll be the usual compatibilistic understanding of settling. As to what's wrong with it, well, I guess I think there are two main arguments that you could bring to bear against it. One, it's quite I don't know how easy it would be to explain this line of thinking in a non-technical way, but it's the problem that's known in philosophy as the problem of deviant causal chains. The issue being that often if you offer a causal account of some phenomenon and you say something like, look, in order to, let's say, in order for agent A to act freely, it's necessary for, necessary and sufficient, let's say, for the mental states of A to cause A's action or something like that. You'll find that your account is vulnerable to certain sorts of counterexamples where you have the causal relationships there in the example, but we still don't feel inclined to say it's a case of action. There are lots of well-known examples in the literature. One example that's used by a philosopher called Davidson is he imagines someone who is climbing a mountain. They're kind of clinging on to their partner on a rope. Their partner's below, they're above, and they suddenly have this terrifying thought that they could, if they wanted, let go of their partner on the rope and the partner would crash to the ground. Okay. Now, suppose they do, in consequence of having the unnerving thought, find that they sort of make an involuntary movement like this, say. Their hands release the grip on the rope, the partner falls off. So they have let their partner fall to the ground, right? And they've done it as a result of a causal result of a want, right? But not in the right kind of way. Okay, the way that the want was operative was not the way that's typically characteristic of action. So then you have to try to fill in the gaps in the description to say what it is exactly that is the right kind of way. What do we require? And that task, for various reasons, turns out to be extremely difficult to solve.
So just to make that clear, maybe. So the idea is the compatibilists want to say we don't need this kind of strong free will you believe in. We just need like my desire and my belief cause my action, like my desire to have a cup of tea. That mental state causes me to have a cup of tea. But then there are these counterexamples where it seems like the relevant desire is there, but we wouldn't want to say the person acted. As you say in the book, though, the different ways you can respond to this, and you said this, it's almost like a lot of philosophers take this as a kind of parlor game of a challenge. How can we get rid of these counterexamples? Whereas you give reasons to think, actually we should think this is just a reason to get rid of that whole way of thinking about action, that actions are caused by our mental states. But yeah, I mean, I suppose it is a very technical debate. But I suppose maybe what might be more intuitive for viewers and listeners is the other argument you give about so-called the disappearance of the agent on a compatibilist account of agency. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, again, this is a complaint that comes up in lots of different guises. This idea that in giving kind of causal theories of action, by which I mean theories of the sort we've just described, where you have certain sorts of mental states causing bodily movements. In theories like that, one thing you haven't got is an agent, right? You haven't got an agent, and you haven't got an action, arguably. I mean, one of the things that I always feel gets missed out in these pictures where you've got, you know, desires, beliefs, intentions, and then bodily movements being caused as a result. And the whole thing's the action, right? You know, that whole causal structure is the action. That feels to me all wrong, because we already know where the right place is for the action to come. The action has to take you from the desires and the beliefs and the intentions and the decisions to stuff actually happening in the world. That's what actions are supposed to do, and they have to be, as it were, enacted, right? There has to be a place in that causal chain that isn't just smooth, like, you know, this happened, that happened, that happened, that. Actions are executive in a special way, and that is missing from this picture. I mean, we don't just sit around waiting for our desires and beliefs and intentions and decisions to do it, do we? We have to do it. And that troubles me about that picture. It misses out. It misses out a crucial stage in the what we normally take to be the provenance of action, which is the bit that we have to do. the acting is not there in the story.
I think that's one thing that that a compatibilist can take from your book. I mean, one very effective thing you do, I think, is to dismantle this or show the implausibility of this rather clunky mechanistic view of how action is caused by the belief being activated and desire being activated somehow, and they're causing an intention, and then an intention. They're causing a decision, and then the decision causing an intention, and the intention causing the movement. So this rather mechanistic picture, which, as you say, doesn't really capture our sense of what agency is at all. So I think that's all very, very important, and something that the compatibilist needs to take on board and recognize that if they're going to provide a compatibilist picture, they need to say something much more sophisticated about the causation of action, and something that, as you say, captures our intuitions about agency too. So I think, at the very least, you've created a challenge to the compatibilist and shown that the simplistic compatibilist strategies that have been adopted traditionally really are very unattractive.
Yes, I mean, I worry about the ease with which we reach for these nouns like desire and belief and intention. Yeah. I mean, I think they are abstract nouns, and the root construction is the verb. Like, believes that, desires that, intends that, and that verb goes with a person, right? With a subject, with an agent, and the picture according to which you can just get shot of that thing, the subject or the agent, and just sit around with the things which are supposed to be referred to by these nouns: belief, desire, intention. No, that can't be the right way around.
So what the compatibilist needs to do is to show how you can have a believing, desiring agent.
Well, how can you have a belief without a believer? I mean, it makes no sense.
I mean, to me, it just feels phenomenologically implausible that this idea that, I have this, like, I'm desire to have a beer, and that desire causes me to act. I mean, I want to say, no, I feel like a beer, and so on that basis, I decide to have a beer. I like, one of my favorite philosophers is Terry Horgan, who has these has a kind of thought experiment where he imagines a creature that lacks what he calls agentive phenomenology, the kind of sense of being an agent you're talking about, and they're sitting there, they find they've got a desire for a beer, and they're getting up, their arms moving out, but that's not how it feels. No. It feels as though I decide on the basis of my beliefs and desires, not that my beliefs and desires compel me to act. I mean, maybe sometimes when you're ravenously hungry, your desire might compel you to act, but that's not the norm. The norm is you're looking for a menu and you think, that would be nice, I'll choose that.
Isn't there a danger, though, that we're now moving back into the realm of the very conscious, explicit decision making, where you entertain the reasons for your for acting in a certain way and decide to do it? What about just the ordinary everyday stuff like eating toast and brushing your hair and walking around? I mean, the agent is doing those things, but they're not considering the reasons for doing them before doing them. How does that work in your picture?
Yes, I mean, I'm very opposed to the idea that there ever has to be anything in agency that's a kind of certain sort of mental precursor, just because I think there's so many kinds of action where there aren't those mental precursors. My favorite example, actually, to try to convince people who think you sort of have to have some kind of decision or like mental choice or something before you do anything, is speaking. No, I'm talking to you now. But am I, deciding before I speak each word that I'm going to speak that word? No, of course I'm not. It just kind of all comes out in one big go. And that's what action's typically like. It's a processual flow over which you've got control, but the control doesn't consist in causation by some prior event, pressing the ignition button and off you go. Not at all. The control is ongoing, and it lasts throughout the process. You don't just initiate and then go to sleep while the events take over.
But why can't a compatibilist acknowledge that and say, yes, look, what's producing? I use the example about speaking myself all the time. There's some sort of processes involved in producing the words. That's reasonably intelligent, not always very intelligent in my case, but there's some sort of causal process that's producing it, and it's coming out. And I don't really. Do I have control over it? Well, I have control in the sense that I could stop and that I can monitor what I'm saying, and I can pause and say, wait a minute, what I just said was stupid, which I do quite often. But why can't that just be another sort of monitoring process, a whole complex suite of monitoring processes that are, again, operating according to ultimately mechanistic principles? Why is there something here that fundamentally challenges compatibilism rather than just challenging naive, simplistic compatibilist stories?
Well, I think the points I was just making was only intended to be a kind of rejoinder to those more naive theories, which insist that to have action, you've got to have mentalistic precursors. And I think what you're asking now, Keith, is an interesting question, which is sort of, well, suppose we don't bother with those sorts of mentalistic precursors, then still there's a different kind of compatibilist who might just be thinking, well, look, the kind of compatibilist I am is a sort of compatibilist who thinks that stuff going on in the brain is constitutive of it's constitutive of the process of producing my speaking, say, or whatever kind of acting it is, and that sort of compatibilist is just going to be wondering whether one couldn't give a kind of deterministic account of all that stuff, and whether that wouldn't be compatible with a certain kind of control. But that I much prefer that version of the question. I think it's a more sensible version of the question, and in some ways I'm very much in sympathy with that version of the question, because there's a level at which I do think, of course acting isn't magic, and of course it's true that when I'm speaking there's all sorts of stuff going on in my brain to enable me to do it. The question, though, is whether an entirely deterministic conception of that processing that's going on in the brain it can be consistent with the idea that it really is up to a being I call me, rather than just, you know, a set of processes part and parcel of the maelstrom of stuff that goes on in the world, can be traced back to the dawn of time. You know, that's the worry.
Because I suppose there is a sense in which, I mean, we tend to look at determinism as and the idea that being more mechanistic and so on as being a limitation on our freedom. But isn't there another perspective from which it actually enables our freedom? I mean, we know that damage to the brain, damage to the mechanisms in the brain, the neural structures, limits our freedom. It prevents us being able to act. You know, if we're paralyzed, we can't move. If we have those kinds of agnosias and things, if we have depression, if we have dementia, also. So, you know, don't we need those mechanisms?
Of course we do.
To be free to be able to. So it's, I mean, rather than thinking of them as constraining us and forcing us, can't we think of them as enabling us?
Well, I think we should think of them as enabling us. I mean, they are. I mean, mechanisms are involved in the human body in a you know, big time, and of course, it would be silly to say that, you know, we're not beings that rely on certain sorts of mechanism and are indeed based on certain sorts of mechanism. But that's a far cry from the sort of mechanism. I mean, what mechanism can refer to is, as it were, universal mechanism. The idea that the universe is one great giant mechanism, and that's, you know, that's a much metronger thesis. You know, I wouldn't want to deny that we each locally rely on the mechanisms or mechanisms that go on in our bodies, and would be lost without them. But that's really different from what you might call mechanism with a capital M, which is this kind of vision of the universe which is sort of Laplacian, you know, such that if you knew the state of the mechanistic system at any given time, you'd be able, in principle, to predict the state at any other time. It's that vision, you know, that universalistic vision, that I would be wanting to quarrel with.
So I need to let Philip come in, but so just to finish that off. So is your worry then about determinism a much broader one than just the implications for agency and free will? That you think it's a bad picture of nature in general?
I do think it's a bad picture of nature in general. I mean, I suppose I've come to think it's a bad picture of nature in general through worrying about agency. But the more I've thought about it, the more I've thought we have no reason to believe it. There's no reason to believe it. I mean, maybe there once was, you know, when we thought Newtonian mechanics was the be all and end all of everything, and that, you know, the whole universe operated according to those principles. Maybe then there was reason to believe it. But, you know, we've left that behind a long time ago. Most physics, most accounts of fundamental physics these days seem to be rather supportive of the idea that there are many indeterministic elements in the universe. So there just doesn't seem to be any reason to hang on to mechanism with a capital M, as far as I can see.
Indeterminism in that sense, though, is rather different from the sort of freedom that many libertarians want. They don't just want indeterminism, lack of determinism. They want some extra self-originating forces in the world.
You're muffling up a bit, Keith. I'm not sure.
Am I? Oh, sorry.
Oh, you're back.
Sorry, I must have wandered away from the microphone. But it seems that libertarians, at least many libertarians, want something a lot stronger than just the absence of determinism. They want the self to be some active causal, causal ingredient in the world.
Of course. I mean, it's nowhere near enough to kind of ground agency to just say, oh, well, the world's indeterministic, so there's no problem then. Because, of course, from a certain point of view, indeterminism can look just as worrying, or indeed even more worrying than determinism for the possibility of agency. And I think actually that's the route which leads many compatibilists to their conclusion. So they start off perhaps being a little bit worried about determinism, But then somebody suggests that indeterminism isn't any better, and then they think, oh yeah, it's not any better. Oh well, I'll go back to being a compatibilist about determinism and free will then. I think that's a very common route. It's like indeterminism doesn't seem to represent a hopeful route out.
This is probably a good point to mention luck, isn't it?
Yeah. I was just going to say this links to the luck objection we'd like to get that I think Keith's going to ask you about. But maybe just finally, before we get to the luck objection, I mean, we've talked a lot about whether problems with compatibilism, and you thinking, our concept of agency involves this idea that we settle things in a way that's incompatible with determinism. But maybe we should say something like about the hard determinist positions. A few people in the comments, Katka, Slutova, and Luke, have in different ways said, well, just because it seems that way doesn't mean it is that way. That's what Katka said. And then Luke said, okay, maybe that's our folk concept, but why should we think that pre-theoretical concept is correct? So what can you say something about what, the more hard determinist picture who agrees with you? Yeah, our normal concept of agency is this, I settle things in a way that's incompatible with determinism. But what about the Sam Harris type line? Maybe that's all an error.
Well, of course, it could all be an error. But, in a way, I'd want to turn that question on its head and say, well, look, this is what we tend to think. Why can't I have it? What is it exactly that you're telling me about the world that means that this is impossible? And that's where I'd really want to press, because when you do press on that question, what you often find comes back is in various ways unsatisfactory. It's, someone needs to say exactly why it can't be true. And I suppose what my book is, in a way, is my attempt to try in very many different ways to say why someone might think it couldn't be true. And then to try to say, but that doesn't work because of this. That doesn't work because of this. So in the end, it's not that I've got a knockdown argument for saying that it couldn't be an illusion. It's rather that I'm wanting still an argument for thinking that it must be an illusion. Why think that something that seems a certain way is an illusion unless it has to be, right?
Yeah, I suppose this comes
the way things were.
It comes back to, sorry.
Yeah, then it's a question of where the onus of proof lies, I suppose. And I think, well, you kind of start with the way things seem in a commonsensically. If someone tells you can't have them, well, then you have to give them up. But until someone tells you why you can't have them, then no reason to give them up then.
I suppose one thing the hard determinist might say here is, well, okay, maybe it's an open question. Maybe I haven't got conclusive arguments for settling my this from science or from philosophy or whatever. But still, how would it? Suppose it were an illusion. How would things be different? It's a sort of Wittgenstein thing. Supposing we think the sun goes around the Earth, but how would it seem if what is it? Why do we think the sun goes around the Earth? Because it seems that way. Well, how would it seem if the sun was static and we were going around the Earth? It would seem just the same. So, from our perspective as these living organisms reflecting on ourselves and our activity, how would it seem different if determinism were true? And if it wouldn't, would we notice any difference if determinism were true? And if we wouldn't, then why does it matter?
I think one thing I would say, well, I've got two thoughts here. One thing I would say is that I'm not a fan of approaches to the free will problem which start from very first personal forms of conviction. Just, it feels to me like I could have done otherwise. That's not what I want to be relying on when I say it seems that I have free will. I'm not trying to rely on that. What I've got in mind is something much bigger than that. that our whole conceptual and social framework is premised on the thought that not just me, but all of you, everybody out there, is an agent, right? Someone that things can be up to, someone that can do things, someone that isn't just a sort of place through which matter streams in some kind of inevitable shape formations. No, that is not the way things are. So one thing I would stress is that I don't mean to be relying on a sort of just a first personal sense that funny feeling that I could have done otherwise. No, I'm talking about something massive, right? Something like belief in the external world. Right. Giving up agency is as big as giving up that. And just as lots of people don't expect me to be able to prove that the external world exists, but allow me to take it on faith, I think there's a good argument for saying, well, same should be true. Belief in agency. You should be allowed to take it on faith unless someone comes along with a very powerful argument for saying it couldn't be so.
Me and Keith are always coming back to questions about foundation. How do you start theorizing about the world? What the agreed start?
Yeah, I know that a lot of debates come back to that, don't they? What are you allowed to start from?
The only thing we're allowed to start with is maybe just physics or science more generally. But what you have to make a lot of assumptions to get that far. As Helen says, like there's an external world, like the future resembles the past,
isn't it? I mean, that's
maybe like the agency.
I guess
so. What if some things seem more evident to me than the assumptions you need to get science going? What if agency seems more evident than the reality of the external world?
If you were a determinist, I don't see that you need to give up this talk of agency. You could say, well, we can't interpret that talk in a certain way. Perhaps we can't see it as being metaphysically grounded in a certain way that maybe we assume it is, but we can still continue with it. It can still do all the practical work that we do. We still think of ourselves as agents in that sense and still interact with each other as agents. I guess this is Dennett's view. And for all, it's pragmatically justified. It just doesn't have a certain sort of metaphysical underpinning. And why does it need it? I guess that would be the response. And what would there be to stop us just continuing to use this very useful, as you say, very central way of conceptualizing ourselves and our activity in the world? What's to stop us continuing thinking of ourselves in this way?
Well, who would the we be that was continuing? Would be my question. I mean, it would. Yes. It seems that you have pulled the rug out from under the ground that any talk of we or me or personal pronouns requires. It feels like it's unsubstantiated words at that point.
Well, I suppose they would be useful fictions, wouldn't they? They would be fictions that help us negotiate. And we live in a world of imagination, and I don't feel the need to have these things underwritten in some sort of deep, metaphysical way in order for them to be useful ways of interacting with. There are all sorts of things when we talk about love, and love is a very meaningful thing. But if you try to say, what actually is love? It's a shorthand for a whole bunch of attitudes and commitments and responses and things, and it isn't a thing. And I guess that's kind of how I think about the self and agency as being a shorthand, a very useful shorthand, and that we don't need to sort of reify it as a, there are agents, there are selves, there is love as such, but there are all the things that those words are tracking, obscurely tracking. I guess that's the way I would come back on it. But
yeah, I mean, I guess I don't really think of it as a reification. I mean, it's not that I'm not a dualist or anything. I don't think there's anything mysterious about thinking there are agents. All I mean is that there are animals. That's what I mean. Whole animals that can do things. So to say it requires reification to believe in agents is already, I think, to have kind of adopted the belief that any form of libertarianism is bound to be anti-naturalistic. And I really don't want mine to be. I really am looking for libertarianism that is consistent and compatible with everything we know about science. But I just don't think that we know from science that the universe is deterministic. In fact, insofar as science offers a view, it seems to me it suggests it isn't. So, yeah.
I said this to you earlier that I think of all the forms of libertarianism I've encountered, that yours is the one that I find most sympathetic, and I really find hard to pin down exactly how much of it I disagree with. I mean, there's a lot of it that I find attractive. Certainly, this emphasis on this rejection of these simplistic, mechanistic, compatibilist stories in terms of beliefs and desires, and of course, I'm totally with that. And the idea that we need to look at large-scale patterns of activity and large-scale structures in giving causal explanations. This is absolutely right, it seems to me. So there's an awful lot of what you're saying that I'm with.
Yes, I mean, as I said, we were chatting before we came on air a little bit, Keith and I, and I was saying to Keith that in a way, I was slightly surprised by the extent to which I've sort of become pigeonholed as libertarian, although that, you know, that is kind of officially, I suppose, the right term for a view of my sort, in that I do think agency isn't compatible with determinism. I did, when I was writing the book, very much think of it as a kind of midway between libertarian and compatibilist position. I thought I was conceding lots to compatibilism on all sorts of fronts. And, you know, I suppose I still think of it that way in some ways, that it's a view that allows two compatibilists a great deal, because I accept that we're physical beings. I just think that doesn't rule out, you know, our reality as agents.
Okay, so I think we want to carry on not too much longer than the 45 minutes. So I think for the remainder of the time, I think what we were interested in is thinking about two objections to this position. One being the Luck objection, and one being, it's come up a little bit in the comments already, you know, is this compatible with causal closure of the physical, or what physical science seems to be perhaps telling us? I mean, Helen sort of already suggested otherwise, but maybe looking into that issue. So maybe we could spend 15 or 20 minutes or so on each of those issues. And also we'd like to get to some audience questions at the end if possible. So Keith, do you want to take us away with the Luck objection?
We've already touched on this a bit, haven't we? It's I think the basic idea is that, well, what's the alternative to my behavior being caused by processes within myself, either mentalistic or other kinds of processes? What's the alternative? That is it just, if I wasn't necessitated to act in a certain way, is it just luck that I acted in that way? And so I suppose at some point I've got some very significant choice to make. So say it could be a moral choice, and I choose it and get praise for it and so on. But I didn't have to do it. I wasn't necessitated to do it. So was it just luck then that I did the right thing? And that doesn't seem to be making me more free or more responsible or more of an agent. It seems to be making me less so, if anything. And I guess that's, as you said, one of the reasons why some people feel that they want to be compatibilist. So how do you respond?
So my response to that is quite a complicated response. The first thing I would want to say is that I sort of agree with the compatibilist view of those sorts of moral decisions. That's to say, if you undertake some sort of morally significant action, suppose you could have done A or B, and you do A, right? It might be that you do A for extremely good reasons, right? You do A B is kind of obviously by your lights absolutely unthinkable or something. So, you know, say it was a situation like that, then is it important that you know, do we need to say that you could have done B? I want to say no, you couldn't have done B. Okay, if it was really clear to you that A was the thing to do, then there's no gain to freedom in saying, you know, that B was also possible. That's not the reason and the place that we need for indeterminism. So that's the first thing to say.
Could we have a concrete example of that, Helen, maybe? Sorry to interrupt. Could you maybe have a concrete example of such a clear case? I think you give one in the book about somebody who's thinking about whether to move in with their girlfriend and it's obviously the right choice or something, just to get people a clearer idea of that.
Yeah, so let me give a proper. So the example in the book is that there's this guy Joe, and he's trying to decide whether to move in with his girlfriend, and I describe it as what I call a clear case. So everything counts for it, right? So he's really in love with his girlfriend. He wants to spend more time with her. Her flat's lovely. His own horrible bedsit is awful, and he wants to get out of it. Also, his horrible bedsit's extremely expensive, whereas, you know, he could live very cheaply in his girlfriend's flat. You know, pile on consideration after consideration until it really looks impossible, right? Given all those considerations that Joe's going to decide to stay where he is. He's going to move in with his girlfriend, isn't he? And saying that he could have made the other decision doesn't help with, it's not something we should want, is it? Why do we want the power to make really crappy decisions? We don't want it. So compatibilists often say that, and I think they're right. Okay, so that's the first thing to say. But my desire for there to be indeterminism in the world comes in at a completely other level. So what I want to say is, before we even get to, you know, situations of moral choice and that sort of thing, we need to be confident that we are the sorts of things that can, for example, you know, move about the world in this way or that way, and, you know, amble over here, amble over there, do this now, do this later. You know, we need to know that we are those sorts of beings rather than the sorts of beings which run on rails, right, according to a predetermined program. That's what we need indeterminism for. It has to come at that the level of basic agency, not at the level of kind of moral choice, you know, where I'm facing moral choice A, moral choice B. It's got to come in at the level of agency. So I think my view escapes lots of very powerful objections to many versions of incompatibilism, because I want to put the indeterminism in, as it were, much lower down. Why do I want to put it in at all? You might ask. Well, I think then I just want to reiterate the sorts of intuitions that I've already started with, because I think we need to be settlers of matters. Because I think unless we are settlers of matters, we're just places where stuff goes on, and that's not what we are. We're more than places where stuff goes on. So I think indeterminism is essential, but I think it's a ground level. It's a ground level phenomenon, not, as it were, a moral phenomenon. That's important.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think this is the point where I'm more of a libertarian than you, I think. So I think what I'd be inclined to say about the Joe case, if we're thinking of Joe, you know, it's a really clear case what they ought to do. I think I want to say we can say both that they were able to make the other decision to not move in with their girlfriend, but in no possible world do they do that.
Yeah,
that's
right. That's right. That is also what I would say. They have,
really?
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
I was hoping I'd found one thing I disagree with, but I'd like to say yesterday I tweeted about this. So the analogy I give is the question, so hypothetically supposing God exists in the traditional sense, could God have tortured kids for fun? And I want to say both yes, because God's omnipotent, God can do anything, so God could have tortured kids for fun. That's part of like the essence of the ability God has. But on the other hand, there's no possible world where God does that, because God's also perfectly good. And I tweeted this. I thought, nobody would respond. Actually, there's been a huge discussion on Twitter. Like nearly 40,000 people have seen this tweet, because it was It's just really interesting. How there is such a thinking of popular philosophy. There's such an interest in these seemingly abstract questions. But all right, so you do think
I think that's totally right. I mean, I do think we need to separate the question, has someone got the power to do a certain thing, from is it possible that it will occur? Those are different questions.
So we agree after all.
Yeah. No
fight here.
That's the sense in which I am compatibilist. I do think that we need to distinguish those things, as compatibilists often have and do. Whether you have the power to phi and whether you will phi, different questions, and the answer to one can be yes, and the answer to the other can be no.
So you're going to need to have an account of what it is to have a power that isn't couched in modal terms, then, I guess.
Modal terms being to do with...
In terms of what... well, certainly if you have a possible world semantics for modality, if you think that to say that something...
I guess that's right, that you'd need to... it would... To say that you've got the power or the ability to do something would have to be thought about differently from, there's a possible world in which, you do. Yeah.
Or you need a different semantics for modal claims that doesn't involve possible worlds.
Yes.
Something's got to give somewhere.
I mean, I think that's probably what I do think for claims about ability, actually, that a possible worlds framework is not well suited to characterizing ability.
Do you want to push the Luck objection anymore, Keith? I think I'm too sympathetic to Helen's response. Do you want to push it on?
I just want to. What puzzles me is I just don't see what, when we talk about abilities, when we're talking now about powers to do otherwise and so on, what this could consist in, apart from ultimately certain systems, subsystems. We want to talk about my having abilities, okay, but I don't quite understand what these. Abilities, say, to monitor, to refrain, to adjust how I behave. I don't sort of understand how to think about these things, except as some perhaps incredibly complex systems within me that implement these capacities, these powers. And what we could mean by saying that I have the power is that there is some system there that could have kicked in, even if there's...
Well, that's almost right, Keith, because that's almost what I think, except that instead of using the word within, I'd say it is me. Right? I am an incredibly complex.
Well, I would too. I would say that these systems are not... The reason why I don't feel determined and pushed around and constrained and necessitated by these systems is because they're part of me. And I don't feel constrained by myself. And so it seems to me that taking seriously the idea that I am just a physical being in this physical world, operating ultimately in accordance with whatever laws govern the world, taking that seriously means that the threat of determinism sort of just seems to evaporate when I'm being determined by stuff that's me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not very far off that view at all, in that what there's two threats from determinism. One is the one that's got all the press, which is, I think, because Van Inwagen's argument became so kind of powerful, which is the one about the past, being determined by the past and the laws. But the other one, which in a way is the one I've been more interested in the book, is being determined by the big things being determined by the small bits inside them, right? That's another kind of deterministic threat. which I do take very seriously. I do feel as though if everything that were to happen as a result of what I call my agency were in fact just a product of deterministic interactions between, you know, cells or whatever inside me, that would have missed me out. But if there can be system down causation, which is what I think must be the key to understanding the metaphysics of agency, if there can be top-down causation from the whole to the part, then we've got the start of what looks to me like a potentially naturalistically respectable story, where indeterminism emerges. It's an emergent property. It's not like there's little indeterministic connections in there which are doing the work. No, that's not the picture, right? The picture is what happens in the whole, right, is determined top down by the whole system. So it's a kind of holistic picture. That's the way I try to suggest it could be, for all we know. And there are reasons for thinking it's not scientifically insane to think that there can be top-down causation.
Well, that links us nicely to the issue of causal closure, I guess, which regular viewers or listeners of Mind Chat are familiar with. So we had a 3-hour debate with the physicist Sean Carroll, and we had a fight about the causal closure issue, which is carried on, and we're having a rematch actually in a couple of months. We're bringing in the philosopher of physics Barry Lower to help us out with it, but it's yeah, and you know, it's a very common view, isn't it, that we have strong empirical reason to think really all causation is ultimately reducible to underlying chemistry and ultimately in terms of underlying physics. Sabine Hossenfelder, another prominent theoretical physicist, has got a video that's got huge hundreds of thousands of views defending this line, saying, look, we know from physics that ultimately everything that happens in the world is explicable in terms of the basic laws of physics. So there might be interesting patterns we can talk about at higher levels, but ultimately everything's explicable in terms of underlying physics. And that does rule out, if that's true, does rule out the kind of picture you eloquently described, Helen, of top-down causation, that it's not my parts that push me around, it's me. Actually, I just have to throw in, I think you saw I put it on Facebook, Helen, that I had a conversation with my 5-year-old daughter on the bus. I said, do you think the bus has feelings?
I saw that.
She said, no, it's just a machine. And I said, aren't you a machine? And she said, no, I'm a person. And so I don't have things inside me that make me move. I thought that, I don't know if you've been reading your book or not, but anyway. So that's your idea. It's not just that our parts it's me. And this fits well with a large part of your thing, is that you think this does, for what it's worth, does fit with our what psychologists call theory of mind, our hardwired capacity to interpret the mental states of others. You think that is a kind of wrapped up in agent causation of this kind. Okay, anyway, so coming to the point, what do you say to the person who says, look, physics or science more generally has just proven that everything that happens is reducible to the laws of physics, and so you're wrong?
Well, I suppose I'd just say I don't think that's true. I think there's an awful lot of stuff that happens in the world that is not remotely explicable by the laws of physics, such as, the outbreak of war in the Ukraine recently, for example, or, there's hundreds and thousands of social and economic and historical facts which are not explicable by the laws of physics. We don't expect them to be, and it would be silly to assume that they were. They are, of course, compatible with the laws of physics, because nothing can happen that isn't. But, that's very, very far from being explicable by the laws of physics. So I just think it's false.
I think everyone can pretty much. I think we can all agree on that. I think that physics just doesn't have the tool, the concepts, the theoretical frameworks. Just doesn't see these things. I mean, they're just they're grand patterns in the world that are just not visible from the perspective of physics. I mean, I think that's the epistemic explanatory.
Keith.
Pardon?
It's not. I think Helen's saying more than that.
Yeah, well, this is it's something we can all agree on, that physics can't explain the behavior of complex systems, because it just doesn't see them as systems. It just doesn't have the concepts to pick them out as systems.
I'm afraid the cat's appeared. I thought I shut her out successfully, but she's shown up.
I think
using her free agency.
What I'd want to press on, though, is I think that yes, that she's doesn't agree with determinism either. That physics, or at least physics, sure, these other things are outside its domain, but we should defer to physics with regard to its own domain. It's probably, the current physics probably isn't right, but it's our best shot at explaining how things operate at that microphysical level. And I think so we should be wary of supposing, or we shouldn't casually suppose, that it might be wrong about the way atoms and electrons and fundamental particles and the universal wave function or whatever evolves, or whatever it takes to be the fundamental entities. So if top-down causation just means that we recognize large-scale patterns and that are explanatory, that are causally explanatory, and that we need to cite in our explanations, that I'm absolutely with you. But if the idea is that there are top-down influences that mean that microphysical things will behave in ways that physicists wouldn't have expected, then I think we do have reason to balk at that, because we should let physicists develop their theory, develop their frameworks. So does your view have the consequence that in certain situations fundamental particles would do things that physicists wouldn't expect them to do on the basis of physical law alone?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think I would say the answer to that is no, because the way I think about physical law, I think the right way to think about physical law is that it's a constraint, okay, on the way things go, but it's not a determinant of the way things go. It doesn't dictate one. Oh, here comes the
For people who are listening on the audio version, like Helen's beautiful cat is wandering in and out,
prowling around because she thinks it's nearly tea time. Yeah. No, so I think that physical, I mean, you fix a set of physical laws, it seems to me, and there's the question, have you thereby fixed everything? And my answer to that is, well, who says so? Physical laws fix what they fix. They fix the fact that things must go in accordance with what they say is the case. But what reason have we, in addition to that, to think that the totality of laws, you put them all together, press a button, outcome just one result? Just one result? No, why not? Why not? Why aren't there many degrees of freedom left once you fix the physical laws? Do we know that that's not the case? I mean, if somebody came and showed me that the laws of physics did indeed yield a unique result, well, then I give up, then I say, I'm just a sort of talking machine. And not what I thought I was, and you win, guys. But nobody has, to my knowledge, ever shown that.
Well, it does mean then that, so we should expect then that it's a prediction of this view that, say, experiments in particle accelerators or whatever sort of experiments physicists do, shouldn't always produce the predicted result based on physical law alone. Is that right?
No, because I mean, I've no idea whether unpredictable results might arise in particle accelerators.
Well, there will be indeterminists, but they will themselves be probabilistically predictable. The probabilities will be defined by physical law. That there should be sort of other influences at work on the way particles behave that are not within the purview of
such as the
physical theory.
influences that are involved when agents interfere.
Exactly.
With systems. If someone comes along to that particle accelerator and knocks into it, things are going to happen to the particles in the accelerator that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And if those impacts from biological entities aren't dictated by the laws of physics, and we're still waiting to be told that they have to be, then indeed things are going to be different in the particle accelerator.
I mean, isn't part of it, I think you refer a little bit to my colleague at Durham, Nancy Cartwright, who's a very influential philosopher of science. She's got this book, How the Laws of Physics Lie, and she points out, connected to what Keith's saying, the kind of experiments physicists do are in very specific, isolated circumstances. Often you have to, I've been talking to my philosopher of physics friend, Kelvin McQueen, getting some advice on the physics I talk about in the book I'm currently writing. And, he's been telling me about, the kind of preparation you go through to do an experiment in particle physics creates a kind of very artificial situation. So I think Nancy Cartwright's view is, okay, this is telling us the kind of things that happen in this very artificial situation, but in the living biological world, it's not necessarily the case that in that very different context there won't be other factors going on. And I think I remember rightly, Helen, like Nancy, you think of the laws of physics as Ceteris Paribus laws, all things being equal. So basically they say, this is what happens unless there are other factors. So if there is agent causation, as you want to defend, it's not that the laws of physics are wrong or violated, because it's, in your interpretation, kind of written into them this Ceteris Paribus clause that unless there are other factors. So I mean, that seems to me a coherent, I mean, this is part of what arguing with Sean Carroll. He was sort of saying, that's not what physicists think. Maybe that's not what physicists think, but it seems to me a coherent philosophical interpretation of physics that the laws have these Ceteris Paribus clauses built into them. Is that?
I'm a massive fan of Nancy Cartwright. I think she's great, and I really like her views of the laws of physics. I think they're very, very exciting and interesting. So yes, another thing I would say about when you said it's not what physicists think, I think you have to be very careful to take into account the huge power that the huge power of education and educational experience on intellectual visions. I've got a colleague who works on genetics, who's very troubled by the way genetics is taught in schools, because he says, everybody does Mendel's pea plants and ends up with this incredibly rigid, deterministic way of thinking about the way genes operate, and so people take on into their adult life, because most people never study genetics beyond school level. They take on into adult life this very oversimplified view about how genes work, and think there's a gene for this and a gene for that and a gene for the other, which of course is just so a million miles from being the case. And I think A-level and indeed GCSE maths and physics has a similar role. I mean, I remember doing loads of projectiles and pendulums and stuff in A-level maths, and everything's beautiful, and it's all closed systems where one thing leads beautifully to another, and nothing ever disrupts the beautiful harmony. And I do think those models, beautiful though they are a bit pernicious when it comes to how many of us then continue to think about the way the physical world is in general, that it's all that projectile and pendulum stuff, but it isn't. I think
there's a point you're making here that I absolutely agree with strongly, and that's about the danger of oversimplification. I think that's absolutely right and very important and salutary. But I don't see why that requires us to make a leap to metaphysical view that rejects. I don't really like the word determinism, but let's say that ultimately the real sort of causal, the fundamental causal processes are described by physics. There's a middle position between this, which says that there's an awful lot of complexity in these processes, in these physically realized processes, an awful lot of complexity and feedback and all kinds of really complex processes that produce something that is, to all intents and purposes, indeterministic, that doesn't have to involve that absolute ground level indeterminism. We can get something that is as near as damn it indeterministic and would look indeterministic even if it were ultimately at that ground level deterministic. And people have been ignoring that because they've got these simplistic visions that you've been talking about. And it's absolutely salutary to get rid of the simplistic visions. But we don't need to underwrite this with some sort of real fun, saying that really, atoms do things that, the individual atoms move in ways that physics wouldn't predict. We don't need that. We just need to recognize the huge complexity of the things that atoms do. So I think a lot of what you're saying, the compatibilists can and should endorse. In a way, in your last chapter, you say a lot about the importance of taking notice of large-scale causal structures and histories and all sorts of things, selectional histories and all sorts of things, in explaining what's happened. Absolutely. But then you say, but this isn't just an epistemic point. It's just an explanatory point. We've got to underwrite it metaphysically.
No,
it's the last step that I resist.
Yeah, I don't think it is just an epistemic point. Let me tell you about one of the things that makes me so resistant to the bottom-up picture. And that is the phenomenon of coincidence. So one of the things that is obvious if you're accounting for something like agency is that in order to account for it, very, very many things have to happen in the brain at just the right time and in just the right order. To enable me to speak to you now, my balance system's got to be engaged so that I'm sitting upright. My language centers have got to be working properly. My memory's got to be working properly. I've got to be visually focused in the right direction. Or, masses and masses and masses of stuff has got to be integrated, right? Now, if you kind of just look at what's happening with the fundamental particles, it feels to me just impossible to explain how that kind of coordination happens.
Absolutely.
How does everything happen at exactly the right time in exactly the right order? It's just all this little stuff, right, banging into each other.
Well,
How do we get the harmonization without a view from the top?
You absolutely need the top view to explain it. Absolutely, because there have been selectional processes over billions of years. Your ability to do this is the consequence of billions of years of natural selection and sculpting these your neural processes to allow you to do this. And that is and there's a whole picture there that you completely miss if you just look at what the particles are doing. But it's not incompatible with as I see it, with the particles just doing whatever they do according to them. Nature evolution has taken advantage of those regular causal processes to sculpt this thing that now coordinates you in the way you're talking about. That would be, well, at least that's the outline of the way I would want to go. That you don't need to have particles doing strange stuff in order to get this complexity, to evolve this complexity, and to explain how it came to be about.
Well, of course, I don't think they're doing strange stuff, Keith. I think they're doing stuff that, they do when they're in biological organisms, quite, and corralled by the structures that brains are.
Well, but they're not doing strange stuff qua particles. They're doing strange stuff qua constituents of sculpted wholes. But as particles, they're still doing what particles do, just as cells do what cells do. But those cells that happen to be in our brains are doing thinking. But they're still just doing cellular stuff at the cellular level. we seem so close and yet so far apart. And I guess this is something that we're not going to resolve right here and now.
No, I feel as
agree with
though
so
many of
much.
the things you say, I just think, well, I think that too. So,
Yeah,
you know,
I
it's interesting that we've come at it from, in a sense, different directions, but I think, agree about a lot. It's
No, I keep trying to get guests on that disagree with Keith, and they always end up agreeing. We're supposed to be everyone always gangs up on me. I want to get people on who
I'm
gang up
sorry,
on Keith.
Philip.
Let me
I'm
down,
sure I
Andy.
agree with you about a lot of things as well.
Should we move to some questions to finish off?
Yeah.
Have you got time for a couple of questions?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so there's a couple here already. If people want to ask, just put a Q and then your question. So regular viewer Queerdo asks, what does Professor Steward think of Professor Akhil Bilgrami's work on agency? Are you familiar with this?
Oh, I haven't read any Bilgrami for a long time. I really enjoyed, what was it? He wrote a book on belief. What was that called? But it's old now. So I like his work in general, but I'm afraid I don't know his stuff on agency. Maybe someone can tell me some more about it, and I'll be able to say.
Actually, sorry, he had an earlier question. How far does thanks, Helen. How far does Professor Steward go with the top-down causation? Are animals the wholes, or do we extend that to the whole universe in a cosmopsychist sense? Oh, so this is the view I've defended at some times, that the whole universe is a conscious entity. And what are the reasons for this? Okay, so are there sort of top-down wholes bigger than animals? I guess might be the. Or other than animals?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question that I haven't really taken a view on. I mean, I only see sort of strong reasons to believe in top-down causation for biological organisms. I have thought a bit about things like, you know, swarms and hives and, you know, colonies and things like that. And I can see there are some grounds for saying that there might be top-down phenomena going on there too. But on the whole, I think the case is not as strong as it is in individual agents. In fact, because I think a lot of the behaviour that you see in hives actually is bottom up when you know the insects or whatever are doing their things, and I'm not sure that there's a reason for saying that there's top-down causation in addition in the colony. But I've got an open mind. I don't really know enough about it to be confident of that. The universe, my instinct is no, but I think it's an open question.
It's how you solve the hard problem of consciousness, you see. That's
okay.
So a connected question from Luke, who's been disagreeing with you a lot, I think is fair to say, in the comments. Can you give one example from current science where researchers posit a mechanism of top-down causation? I guess you're going to say no in that case, what you just said.
Well, no, I am going to say yes. I'm going to say, well, I don't know if it's a mechanism of top-down causation. That's not quite how I describe it, because it's not exactly a mechanism. But I first kind of started to think about top-down causation as a result of talking to a scientific colleague when I was at Balliol, whose name was Dennis Noble. And he worked on the heart. He was a cardiologist, but a very sort of eminent scientist more generally. And his view of biological systems was that they were hierarchical systems, and that parts that were lower down the hierarchy were, as it were, corralled into acting in certain ways by things that came higher up the hierarchy. So what molecules do in cells kind of depends on the cell, right? And what cells do in tissues depends on the tissue, and what tissues do in organs depends on the organ, and so on and so on. Which, you know, led me to think, well, you know, if we are hierarchical in that way, why aren't we, as it were, just the top level? We're the whole animal, the top level of that hierarchical system, corralling our parts. In particular, when it comes to action, what we're corralling is parts of our nervous system in order to bring them about. So it is actually from a scientist that I first got the idea, who thought it made sense in, you know, the science that he was interested in, which I guess was physiological science. So yeah, that's my example.
Very good. Thanks, Helen. That's very interesting. Question from Mark O'Brien here. I would just like to say, actually, before, so Mark is disagreeable me on Twitter, and someone I've been arguing with on Twitter for a couple of years, disagreeing about almost everything. And he's just recently happens to have moved from New Zealand to Durham, and so we met up and in person and had an argument in person, which is so the wonders of Twitter connect things up. But anyway, Mark's asking, can we simulate or model down top-down causation? If so, how is this not deterministic? If not, then it seems the rules or principles of top-down causation are not well defined. So there's a sort of dilemma there, challenge of dilemma.
Well, I'm not the sort of person who could write the program, that's for sure. But I would imagine it could be simulated. And I'm a bit puzzled by the suggestion that that would make it deterministic, because as I understand it, simulation is often most valuable and useful in connection with systems that are thought to be indeterministic. You know, ones or at least full of massive chaos, such as, you know, meteorological systems and things. I would have thought the possibility of simulation didn't entail that a system was deterministic.
But we can, the point is that we can simulate these things. You can get chaotic systems from very simple deterministic processes. The equations that generate fractals are very, very simple ones, but they're just iterated a lot. And you know, the fact that if we can simulate something, then ultimately we're doing it by programming a computer. That's how you do the simulations. But I think chaotic and indeterministic are different things. Chaotic may be practically indeterministic in the sense that there's no way you can predict it. That's not the same as saying that it's not generated by a deterministic mechanism. And I think that's in a way, that's probably goes to the heart of where we might disagree, that you can get all kinds of complexity from deterministic mechanisms. Anyway, I'll butt out now, I think, because I've said plenty.
Well, maybe a nice question to end on is another question by Mark Brewer. Sorry, it's a different Mark. What would it take for you to reject libertarian free will?
Well, I guess I'd have to reject the libertarian bit of libertarian free will. If someone were to show to my satisfaction that, you know, physics had proven, say, that universal determinism was true, I think it would be a very difficult thing to prove, because I think that determinism ultimately, at least in the way I understand it, is actually, it's not a thesis of physics, because it's modal. It's, you know, it's about things being necessary, necessary happenings. So I kind of think of it as a metaphysical thesis, and so I'm not sure how a scientific proof of it would ever come about.
I guess some people might worry it's unfalsifiable, but maybe that you don't think that's necessarily problematic.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do think that probably a lot of theses are, you know, unfalsifiable.
and we just have to, at least by empirical means. And so we have to look to other resources to try to figure out whether they might be true or not. I mean, yeah, this is a bit of a distraction, but I in fact don't like the standard definition of determinism, which is in terms of everything being entailed by the laws and the initial conditions, which is the standard definition. Because I actually think that according to that definition, we should all be compatibilists. I don't think that is a definition which really gets to the nub of the problem. That the worry that people have about determinism is nothing to do with entailment. It's to do with necessitation. It's a metaphysical idea, not a logical idea. That's at the heart of the thesis that's worrying. But that's a side issue which we probably don't have time to go into.
I saw you give a talk on that somewhere, Helen. Yeah, that's can't remember where now, but yeah, it's a very interesting take on it. Okay, well, we've been talking 2 hours. That's been a fantastic discussion.
Oh, it's been so enjoyable. So enjoyed it. And I've got to go away and figure out why Keith and I don't agree. If indeed we don't.
No.
I think one thing that's been lovely about this is we started by just asking you how you got interested in philosophy and thinking about the mind. And it is about this reconciling this conception that we have of ourselves with what science tells us about the world. And that's exactly what we've been talking about for the whole 2 hours, about this how we see ourselves as part of the world, as part of the natural world. And in a way, that's perhaps one of the, I wouldn't say it's the heart of philosophy, but it's certainly one of the central issues of philosophy. And it's one of the things I think that everybody must be fascinated by that question. We're here able to reflect on ourselves and our own existence, and how come we're here in this world?
It's one of the basic questions of philosophy, isn't it? That
if that doesn't fascinate you, absolutely. So, and I think your book is a great contribution to our thinking about that.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you.
Seriously.
And thanks to the audience for coming along and listening in.
Thank you, Helen.
I'm glad the technical problems resolved themselves eventually.
Yes, that was a bit of a relief. Yeah. And
thanks to your cat for patiently enduring.
What's the name?
Yeah, she was my exhibit number 1. Look at this 3-wheeled agent, everybody.
What's her name?
Sushi.
Sushi.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, thanks so much, Helen. Thanks so much for giving a couple of hours of your time. And
you're very welcome. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Okay,
thank you. Take care. Wow, that was fun.
It was good, wasn't it? Yes.
Yeah, this happened last time, right? David Papineau was supposed to be somewhat a materialist we both disagreed with. And then the whole thing ends up you saying, oh, actually, we both agree on everything. What? I'm always the odd man out.
I try to see what I agree with in people's work rather than what I disagree with. You see, I try to look for what people have got right. I mean, and I think it's a helpful.
No, yeah. In all seriousness,
we're all trying in the end to understand things, and very few people have got it completely wrong. Anyway, very few people have got it completely wrong. So there's always something, and in fact, there's often a lot more than you think. If you just take the caricature of somebody's views, whoops, sorry, just knocked something over. If you take the caricature, the headline of somebody's views, like Frankish thinks consciousness doesn't exist. Well, I know, what a fool Frankish is. But if you try and burrow down a bit into their views and see what they're actually trying to get at, you might find that there's something there that you can really agree with and build on and perhaps integrate into your own view. And that's in the end how we're going to solve problems. Not by some individual genius working it all out, but by collectively pooling our resources, gaining insights from each other, and approaching something like the truth.
Absolutely, and that's what we're trying to do on Mind Chat, isn't it? Trying to get rid of just this polarized shouting at each other and trying to understand where the other is coming from. and I'm very proud of it, actually.
Yeah.
Just I'm joking really about wanting fights, or at least all the time.
I know.
So yeah, well, I'm actually on another podcast in an hour. We keep not having time for end chats.
Busy schedule. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing about your book, but we'll maybe have to leave that to another time.
And your discussion. What is the name of your podcast? Your other podcast, Keith?
My audio podcast. It's Mind to Mind.
Mind to Mind. Good.
Which is a riff on Face to Face, the famous BBC one, you see. But that's more centered on talking to people and letting them talk about themselves and explain themselves, rather than the more the discussion format that we have here. It's more of a straight interview.
Well, maybe
soon, by the way, which I will be recording early next month with Pete Mandy.
Oh, right. Brilliant. Excellent. I like Pete. Oh, yes. Right. Well, maybe for our anniversary, we could have a chat about my reactions to some of those discussions, and we could argue about that a bit, and talk a bit more generally about what we've been up to and so on. Yeah. I mean, it's not all about fighting, is it? I think, there are things we disagree on, but at the end of the day, we definitely agree that consciousness. I've forgotten what it is. I thought that was going to be really. We definitely agree, on the whole, that consciousness is wherever it is,
and nowhere else.